Always the fun part. Okay, it says we are live. Hello, and what the hell is up with biodegradable plastic? You've probably heard about it. You've probably seen those little signs on plastic cups. People are definitely talking about how can we figure out how to make sustainable plastics? What does this mean? We're going to dive into that today. This is Ask Me, I'm a Scientist. I am Susanna Harris, and basically all this is that you get an opportunity to ask real scientists questions about their research. You can send in these questions through social media, through the live chats. It's super unprofessional, it's super casual, it's unedited, unscripted. It's supposed to just be a conversation because researchers are real people. Before I get started, have to do the plug, like, subscribe, so that I know I should keep doing this and that everyone's not super bored. So, to jump in, today we have Natasha Gunawan. She is a recent master's recipient, graduate from UCSD, and works in something called Algenisis. We're going to get to that. She's going to be talking about ongoing research into creating sustainable, biodegradable materials for use in consumer products. So the stuff that you and I actually get to use. Everything from like cups to flip-flops. I'm super excited because I can actually share some stuff about the flip-flops. Anyway, I'm going to jump over because she's going to do a much better job than I will of explaining this. So, hey Natasha, how's it going?
Hi, it's good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm over here in Chapel Hill. So you're in San Diego.
Yeah, I'm in San Diego right now.
Yeah, I'm sort of jealous. We originally got connected through like he's one of my friends. He works in your lab, right?
Yes, Anthony, yeah.
Yeah, so Anthony Burnt, really awesome guy. And actually, I talked to him about his research a lot, and he does more protein sort of things. But we're talking about these
Yeah.
flip flops, and he was like, "Oh, if you want to talk about the plastic side, you have to talk to Natasha." So, yeah, could you start out by just letting us know, who, like, what is sustainable, what is biodegradable plastic, because pretty much everything eventually degrades, right?
Yeah, so I think the big difference between true biodegradation and kind of when it's not is basically the formation of microplastics. So I'm sure a lot of people have heard about microplastics, but something that Algenesis, the company that I collaborated with on my master's, they're the ones who are trying to produce this like biodegradable plastic. And something we've tried to focus on is differentiating between just forming tinier pieces of the same original chemical structure, if that makes sense, versus true biodegradation is like the chemical bonds are like cleaved, if that makes sense. So the
Mm-hmm.
actual internal like structure is cleaved to where the resulting product is less toxic and not as persistent in the environment. Like it's soluble and it's able to basically become part of like organisms that are eating it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how we've been thinking about it is whether or not organisms can incorporate that chemical into its energy source. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, because I guess when you're talking about that, I'm kind of thinking of like, it's not the same, but thinking about how maybe if there's complex sugars or something like that, you can grind them up in a spice grinder, but they're still like super tiny
Yeah, yeah.
granules. Versus if you put them in a liquid, they will kind of diffuse out. But in this case, like I guess the bio part of biodegradation actually has to do with what's degrading it.
Yeah, no,
Ah.
it's definitely that's something that we wanted to study a lot is I know you have like a background in microbiology, so we it's interesting because I didn't really have that much of a background in microbiology before.
What did you
And
study before?
so yeah, in my undergraduate I did environmental chemistry, which sounds like it's pretty similar to like this kind of thing, but it was more I guess studying like actual environmental processes, not really like green chemistry.
Yeah.
So it was more like studying like I guess the water cycle, but not really, but like
Huh.
things like that, like environmental processes,
Okay.
and analytical stuff like that. So then for my master's, it was interesting because this project kind of incorporates chemistry with biology because we were also trying to study those microorganisms. So that was the first time I really got a deep dive into like how to do sequencing and things like that. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I know from Anthony's work, there's just there's so many layers to this. It's not, I mean, it's chemistry, it's understanding impacts on the environment, it's understanding metabolism of microbes. It's yeah, there's a lot of things. I want to also, before we jump into all of the questions that people asked, what is
Mhm.
Algenesis?
Yes, yeah. So Algenesis Materials, it's a company, a startup company that was founded by my PI, Stephen Mayfield, and several other professors in like algae fields and chemistry, biology.
Mm-hmm.
The three PIs that I work with, it's Stephen Mayfield, Robert Pomeroy, and Michael Burkhart. And so that's kind of who I've been in close contact with the past 2 years doing my master's is um, the three like collaborations. Yeah. And essentially the company is trying to develop bio-based products, specifically polyurethane. It's a type of plastic,
Hmm.
um, kind of when you think of like foam materials. So originally their idea was to make a surfboard, like algae-based surfboard. Now it's kind of pivoted to more focusing on footwear, but also a bunch of other different types of materials because polyurethane is pretty, um, I guess the word is like it, you can really like it's flexible in terms of like you can adjust it and you can
Mm-hmm.
make it hard or soft. So it's a good material to be playing around with, I guess, in
Yeah.
terms of trying to make it more bio-based or less. So yeah, so they're basically a startup company trying to make algae-based plastics.
That's super. It's just so cool. I don't. I can't really even wrap my head around it, and so I need to jump into these questions because I have a million, but that's not the point. Uh, so let's see. So we're going to start out in questions from Instagram. People can see my handle down below. They can actually see your LinkedIn in case they want to find a little bit more about you. But for folks listening, like if you have questions for speakers in the future, I announce these all on Instagram and Twitter in advance, so you can ask the questions. Um, okay, so okay. Let's start with this one. So, Stove Helmet on Instagram asks, what is the plastic consumed by bacteria broken down into? You mentioned these tiny pieces like breaking the bonds and things. What eventually is that?
hmm Yeah, so plastics are essentially polymers, and what that means is they have repeating units of a small like chemical structure. So it's just like a string of repeating units, if that makes sense. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, what each of those chemicals are is going to vary depending on what type of plastic. If it's a more simple plastic, if it's more complicated, so that part varies. But the basic idea is that there's bonds within those chemical structures.
Mm-hmm.
And so organisms, if they are able to biodegrade that plastic, they would be able to cleave that bond,
Mm-hmm.
normally using enzymes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, so they would be able to cleave that bond, and then they would be left with that chemical portion or like partial, like
Mm-hmm.
oligomers, if that makes sense. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, basically, they're able to cleave bonds within the structure.
Hmm.
And so, normally, if they are doing that, it's because they want to be able to use, for example, the carbon source in one of those chemicals, the nitrogen source, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the general idea is that you would be cleaving the plastic into smaller chemicals, and then maybe eventually those organisms would be able to incorporate the carbon or the nitrogen and cleave even more.
Wow.
So that's generally the basic principle, and that's what we've been basing our research on is
Hmm.
trying to study whether or not we see those monomers.
Gotcha. It kind of sounds to me, as you're talking, I'm thinking about it as like it's sort of like how certain pieces of furniture, if you have the right tools, you can break them down and make new furniture. And
Yeah,
so it's like figuring out which tools the bacteria have, like what other furniture they want to be making, and then kind of designing tables and chairs so that they can then go and use the different pieces to do whatever they want.
yeah, exactly. So, like, that's a good point because one of the experiments that we've tried to do is based on that principle, where we basically only give the organisms our plastic, like no other carbon source. So we're trying to see whether or not under like conditions where they're forced to do that, they can eat the plastic, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, super, super interesting. So I've got another question. This one's from Science Sam on Instagram saying, how can you tell what kind of plastics? Like the symbols are confusing. I know that,
Oh, yeah.
just like generally the recycling plastic, there's a bunch of numbers, but now there's like different things that have plants. What do the symbols mean, and how do you figure out what's going to happen with your plastic cup?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Honestly, I still need to do more research on like exactly what each number means, but I think generally it is related to the way whether or not you can recycle it firstly, and then what happens in the recycling process to it. A lot of the times with plastics that are recycled in the traditional sense, it's essentially grinded up into smaller plastics and then either remelted into that original form, or that grinded up plastic is used in some sort of way as like filler or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's kind of my knowledge of recycling in the traditional sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the general how I've kind of gone about recycling is that if it has that symbol, you can put it in recycling.
Yeah.
I think that's correct. Um, and then one thing that I know people often think is recyclable but isn't is like plastic bags, I'm
Oh,
pretty sure.
okay.
I think in some places it is recyclable, but in a lot of places, plastic bags, like single use, plastic bags aren't recyclable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but sometimes people will think that, yeah.
Yeah. So, and is there like a regulated, because I know that those numbers are based on like legitimately where the stuff is supposed to go, how it's supposed to be treated. But for biodegradable stuff, is there like, is that regulated? Do those
Yeah.
mean anything?
Yeah, it's exactly, yeah. So, like I think in the beginning you had mentioned like a lot of times you'll see on like products like oh biodegradable
Yeah.
or sustainable or something like that. And a lot of the times those kinds of terms aren't really regulated in
Mm-hmm.
terms of a strict standard of what's biodegradable. There are standardization methods like ASTM and ISO. Those are two like big company or not company organizations that standard that have like standard test methods for biodegradation.
Mm-hmm.
But what we've been finding throughout our research is that a lot of the times they focus on carbon dioxide production,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense. So
Mm-hmm.
like they'll study a
Yeah.
plastic in a sort of like experimental setup and then analyze whether or not carbon dioxide is being produced.
Uh-huh.
And although that does tell you something about whether or not organisms are doing something in that setting,
Yeah.
and like using the plastic in some sort of way, it doesn't necessarily tell you like what the byproducts are in the end or what you get out of it,
Okay.
like the plastic structure. So I think there's a lot of room for more research on how to standardize biodegradation and really make sure that when a product says it's biodegradable, it's true biodegradation and not just like not that you need to like do something crazy to it for it to be biodegradable. Because a lot of the times a product may say it's like compostable,
Yeah.
but in reality you actually have to like heat it up really hot to get it to degrade in a compost bin,
Mm-hmm.
or you have to like add some sort of reagent or something. So yeah, that's kind of where there's kind of room for growth for that industry. Yeah.
Yeah, because I've seen the compostable stuff, and I've heard that sort of similar thing where it's like, it's all about. They say compostable, but they actually mean like in an industrial setting. If you're
Yeah.
putting it into
Yeah.
an industrial compost bin, and because I've also
Yeah.
heard of people who are like, I got this compostable like styrofoam thing, and
Hmm.
it's been in my compost for a year. Uh,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because no one really has access, or I guess the normal person doesn't really have access to an industrial compost setting,
yeah,
which is extremely hot. And yeah,
yeah. So okay. Huh. Okay. We've got a question about like this term environmentally friendly, asking how degradable are quote environmentally friendly end quote dog poop bags from Navi Ratnachira. Um, so I guess this also branches into a bigger question of there are some times where I see biodegradable or environmentally, I guess environmentally friendly can also be how it's produced, but
yeah,
like all this different stuff, and I'm also looking at it like I don't really want this particular product to dissolve while I'm using it.
Yes, yeah, that's true. Um, I think a lot of the times the term environmentally friendly is more vague, I think, just
Hmm.
because it doesn't necessarily claim that it can degrade or things like that, but maybe it was produced in a really uh like zero waste manner. But I think nowadays there are, if it's like a dog poop bag, I would assume that those are pretty easy to either compost or degrade. I feel like they would be pretty compostable, um, but I could be wrong about that. Um, but going off of what we were talking about in terms of when you're using it, you don't want it to biodegrade. One thing that, in terms of like the footwear that we've been talking about, that we've done is if you have like a seal almost around it of that plastic material, it's very hard for the material to biodegrade because essentially how biodegradation works in terms of cleaving bonds is it's a process called hydrolysis,
Okay.
which you need water to access those bonds, if that makes sense, or you need to
Uh,
basically it's using water to break those bonds.
okay.
Um, a lot of the times enzymes will be able to do that process, but it's the water that's really important.
Uh-huh.
So if, for example, it's like a sealed structure, if water can't get through that, then it won't just degrade. Essentially, like if you're wearing your shoes and things like that, it's more when it's been sitting for a while and then it breaks open or something like that, then water will be able to access it, and then you'll see like the material start to like yellow and things like that, and then over time it'll biodegrade.
Neat. Okay, so speaking of shoes, I just showed a sneak peek of the shoes that I actually have a sample of the stuff that your lab has been working on. And to speak to one, these shoes are like several, like over a year old. Um, they're really gross looking now because these are, you know how everyone has a pair of flip flops that they keep near the door because it's one of those like,
Oh
oh, I need to run out and do something, but they're really
yeah. Mhm.
comfortable. That is these flip flops. These are my like, let's go. Um,
Yeah.
and to the point about them being really sturdy, what people can see, what I'm holding up here, is that the shoe itself is black, but the band is now orange because I left them out in the sun. The band is not biodegradable, the band is just fabric. And that used to be black. So this is actually like the fabric has bleached out, but the shoes are still intact. So
Yeah, yeah.
they are pretty durable. When I got this sample, I was like, I don't really want to wear shoes that are going to fall apart.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's definitely a concern. And with like their production side, because I've been more focused on the biodegradation aspect, but in terms of production, um, Algenesis gets a lot of questions like that when they're working with other companies. Yeah, basically, how can they make sure that it's still a good product, which is it's really important for when you're creating like a green replacement, is
Mm-hmm.
that it still is a good replacement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've got a question here in the live chat from Linda Corcoran asking, will biodegradable plastics actually be put into use? Because there is currently a lot of recyclable plastics that never get recycled. So how do we ensure that this won't happen? How do we make sure this isn't just like a fad that people feel really good about themselves because they bought this thing and then it still ends up in a landfill forever?
Yeah, I think that's a good question because I think a lot of the times there are kind of green products that we don't really like, they might not actually end up being a green product, but they're marketed in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of where we can shift that is obviously through research and like showing that it is feasible to create a product um, that is truly degradable in the end.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing that I think is interesting is if we were somehow able to collect in the end like plastics and then use enzymes to degrade it
Mm-hmm.
into monomers, for example, and then potentially reuse those monomers as another
Wow.
form of plastic. But that's obviously that's there's been some research on that. So recently, I think there were two other papers from different labs that have done a similar thing like that, where they're trying to recycle plastics in a different way in terms of chemically recycle them.
Uh-huh.
Um, so I think that's where a lot of that will be interesting in the future.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of what I guess like people can do in general to ensure that they're um, truly buying a product that's sustainable is, I guess, looking at like studying what that product actually claims and whether or not it truly is degradable.
Mm-hmm.
As well as just, I think, making like using products to the extent that they can, if that makes sense, like not replacing things unnecessarily,
Yeah.
which I when it's like when you're like one person, it seems like it's not a big deal, but I think that that is kind of still important, even though there are all these new advances.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, but I think the market definitely does need a shift as well. So that's kind of where people need to realize that even though we look at all these things on the market and we think everything's really green now,
Mm-hmm.
um, there's still a lot more that we can do, and the market kind of sometimes it's not the best. Yeah.
That's really interesting to hear from you because you are a researcher, right? Like, I think this highlights the fact that a lot of researchers, people think that we want to oversell our science and be like, this is, and maybe we sometimes have to in conferences and things, but, you're not saying this is the perfect thing in the world, this is a solution, let's just do all these things all the time. Like, there are some caveats to all of this kind of like push towards biodegradable plastics.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is that I guess going back to the previous question and incorporating to this, but with companies like Algenesis and other companies trying to make biodegradable products, I think the focus that is really important is that they're really making sure that it's naturally biodegradable.
Mm.
And that's not something that, like, I guess the consumers can really control, is whether or not a bunch of other markets are coming up with truly biodegradable products. But
Right.
that will become important is having, having in the production stage, that's kind of been thought out, is that are these bonds easily broken, basically, are these chemical bonds easily broken?
Huh. Yeah, and that kind of goes to a question on Twitter from Tiny Engineer. A little bit of background because they were hyped. Says, I'm a nanoscale engineering undergraduate student and I work with cross-linked hydrogels that are biologically compatible. I'm also considering going for a PhD in materials engineering. So away we go. The question that they asked a bunch of questions, and I'm going to send all these to you later so that we can try to answer
Okay.
them. But
Yeah.
one question that we haven't touched on because I don't really know what it means. Does biodegradability have any relation to biological compatibility? I don't know what that is.
Um, I'm not entirely sure what the biological compatibility part is referring to, but
Mm-hmm.
I guess one thing the question does remind me of is like whether or not like how you can design the plastic to be biodegradable. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if that's exactly what they were trying to ask,
Yeah. Yeah, I
but
wonder if it's like, because we talked about the different microbes and things, and also that the environments we put it in. So,
yes. Oh yeah.
are we thinking of this is just going to show how little I actually know about the topic. When we talk about biodegradable plastics, is the idea that let's say I'm out in the woods and I
Mhm.
bring like a cup of Cheetos. I don't know what I'm doing in the wood with Cheetos, but I've got a cup of Cheetos and I eat my Cheetos and I want to get rid of the cup. Is this something that I'm just going to like toss it into the forest? Am I going to bury it? Like what is
Mm.
this like a leaf
Yeah, yeah,
now?
yeah. Yeah, so no, I think that is kind of what the question was hinting at. And to answer that, I think the goal would be that the product is naturally biodegradable, right? So like if, for example, you did bury it, that would be pretty cool if like in like a month or something, you already saw it deteriorating.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's something recent, like with my thesis and everything, the project that I focused on, we were just essentially doing that, like burying the material in compost and soil
Mm.
and seeing what happened. And one question I did get from one professor was that like, is the goal that you would be able to bury your stuff because no one's really going to do that, right? Like, or yeah, a lot of people wouldn't really do that typically.
I'm just thinking
Um,
of like a cup graveyard in my
yeah,
backyard. Like,
yeah, it's just a bunch. Yeah, so I think although yeah, obviously that's not the goal, but to have something where it's been designed in such a way that it could degrade in soil or compost, like environments that are totally accessible to people,
mm-hmm.
um, I think is important because that means that the chemical bonds are easily broken by
Yeah.
organisms. So if it did end up, for example, in a landfill, a lot of the organisms that you find in soil and things like that are comparable to things you find in landfills.
Mm.
So it kind of gives more chance that the product will be degraded in a landfill, for example. So I think although you're studying just one environment, I think it can transfer over to other environments that that product might end up in the end. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of different things to consider. Um, Scott, aka Hewitt Lake, on Twitter, says like, do you have any statistics on plastic recycling cost benefits, and like, are there advances, sorry, in plastics coming in the future to make them more planet friendly? Like, what do you see as the future of biodegradable plastics, other than
Yeah.
surfboards and flip flops?
Yeah. No, I think that there's kind of two components to developing a biodegradable or a sustainable product.
Hmm.
So we kind of touched on this, but like in the pre-production stage or just the production stage, if you're able to develop that product from non-fossil fuels,
Mm-hmm.
like from algae, for example, or other sort of bio content source things,
Mm-hmm.
that already is great because you're obviously limiting the the fossil fuel use.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then in the post-production sense, uh, what we've been talking about, like having it so that it can degrade, would be also another component. So I think that is where products kind of that's the goal of this product and the goal of like a lot of what Algenesis stands by is having that kind of having that in a product. And then in terms of what I think is important in the future is um, being able to just replace like day use products with things that are truly biodegradable, I think would be really cool. And so things like plastic bags or plastic containers and things like that, because a lot of times the products that we think you can just recycle, they aren't typically the majority of the time recycled in the end. To just because a lot of the traditional recycling, the costs kind of aren't worth it to like the companies. You know what I mean? Like it's just it takes more energy, more money to recycle it than to just produce a new plastic bottle,
Mm-hmm.
for example, which is unfortunate. And I think a lot of it is stuff where the actual like money side of things will need a shift for it to be a truly new way into the future. In terms of, I guess, just like making having sustainable products be more easily accessible and more affordable. Um, yeah, so I think some of the things it seems like we can't control it, but we are all consumers, and I feel like if you kind of like vote with your dollar and you stand by companies that are trying to make products that are degradable and really good for the earth. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's hard to be a responsible consumer, but I think, if we can all, I'm going to speak for myself. If I can spend hours reading BuzzFeed quizzes, then I can probably spend 20 minutes to figure out where some of my stuff is coming from, especially if I'm using it a lot. So let's do one more question related to that, actually. Scott Edenstrom, if I read it correctly. What's better for the environment moving forward, recycling or biodegradable? And also, could biodegradable plastics be recycled? Like, could we end up with hybrid things? I guess those are different. I don't know.
Um, yes, I think you can have a product that's both recyclable in the traditional sense, but also biodegradable, just because if you were, for example, to take that product and you didn't introduce like organisms to eat it up and stuff, you just went to the recycling process, it is still a chemical structure, if that makes sense. So
Uh-huh.
it could be recycled in that traditional sense. Um, sorry, what was that first question?
Oh, just like which one's better?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the goal, okay, I think biodegradable, if we really did have products that were truly biodegradable in that sense and naturally like over time they would degrade, they wouldn't persist for thousands of years in the ways that some of these plastics does. I think that would be I don't know if better is the right word, but I think that would be really important.
Yeah.
And then I think just because I think recycling a lot of the times, like what we kind of touched on, it doesn't end up happening just because it's not cost beneficial to a lot of companies. Um, and I also think it's, yeah, like I think that's mainly the thing. And then um, in the end, that product, if it still has that chemical structure that's really durable, then it'll still persist in the environment in the end.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, so
And
I
it,
think yeah, that's kind of where my head is at with that. And but I do think that true like if products were truly recycled over and over again,
mhm.
I don't see a problem with that obviously. Like I think that would be great as well. I think it's just that right now the way that a lot of products are recycled aren't actually like closed loop like that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean something that Linda brought up in the chat was that currently plastic recycling is often outsourced to parts of Asia. I've heard about this
Yeah.
before, and it sounds like using biodegradable plastics, that's something that maybe countries could do more on their own, if this
Mhm.
is actually feasible. Like,
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And it's mainly about, I guess I kind of mentioned this, but it's about like in the production stage, creating those chemical bonds that are
mhm.
easily cleaved because some bonds are more stable than others. So that's kind of, um, yeah, like that would be cool to keep that into account when you're making the product.
Yeah. So, and I know I said it was the last question, but these two are really good and it relates to
Okay.
Algenisis.
Yeah.
Okay, so Justin asks, how does this relate to small business manufacturing? And I bring that up because Algenesis is a new, smaller business. And then Jaden asks, how can we pressure companies to use biodegradable products? In my mind, these kind of link together, right?
Yeah, no, I think they definitely do because I'm just thinking of Algenesis
Uh-huh.
and how they've dealt with both of those issues, I feel like. Yeah, so for the first one, Algenesis is a smaller company. It's like a lot of the people who work at Algenesis graduated from UCSD, but also other places. So that's kind of how it started.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think the way that they've dealt with that, uh, I guess first being a small company, is that if you're creating a product that is really cool, I feel like that that all automatically elevates your small business.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think this tying into the second one of how to pressure companies to do that is through collaboration,
Mm-hmm.
obviously with those other companies. If you're able to tell that company, oh, I have this good green replacement and it's just as good as your traditional flip flop, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where it'll be like successful. Yeah, like really developing cool products that are just as good as their petroleum based counterpart, if that makes sense. Yeah.
That's rad. Okay, and then the question I warned you about, which is in this space, like, what are you interested in? Like, what are you researching? What are you excited to see happening next?
Yeah, I touched on the biorecycling, which is using enzymes to break up the plastic and then taking that plastic again and creating new plastics. So it's like biorecycling, not just traditional recycling. And I think that's where I'll definitely be like keeping an eye out in research about other companies and other labs doing work like that.
Yeah.
I just think that would be, yeah, that would be super cool if we could do that in some sort of way in like a big scale.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, I think just studying the chemistry of how enzymes work and how organisms are really eating those plastics, I think, yeah, like just knowing more about that would really help the field.
Enzymes are like the coolest shit. I just,
Yeah,
oh
no,
god,
there's so much to study with those. Yeah.
they're so bizarre. But
Yeah.
anyway, Natasha, thank you so much. This was super cool.
Yeah,
Are you
thank you.
comfortable with people reaching out to you? I can also send on some of these questions. Like you had so many questions. This would have been a 3 hour video.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'd be happy to answer a question. And if I don't know the answer, I'm sure there's someone who I've been working with who knows the answer. So yeah.
Awesome. All right, I will talk to you very soon.
Hmm.
Okay. Well, everyone, thank you so much for coming. This was really fun, as per usual. Love what Natasha said at the end, which is like, if she doesn't know somebody, like, there are other people who know. And most of the time, researchers want to talk about their stuff and they know somebody who wants to talk about it. So just definitely don't hesitate to reach out to scientists. I'm glad that I can provide some sort of space for that. If you know a scientist, a researcher, a medical professional, somebody who wants to talk about really cool shit, let me know. Get me in touch with them because I'm always looking for more people to talk about, including yourself. Feel free to self promote. Okay, I'm gonna go off and do my own actual work, but I hope you all have an awesome rest of your day. Bye. Woohoo! Okay. Let me exit out of this thing.